Hey everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our Bible study. We are in Matthew chapter 22 today, making our way through the book. We're going to talk about a summary of this chapter in 5 minutes. If you want the handout that you're about to see on the screen, there's a link to download it in the description. If you want to support the creation of free resources like this to help people around the world understand the Bible better, there's a link to our Patreon account. Now, Chapter 22, when did the events of this chapter take place? Well, this would have been during Jesus' earthly ministry, approximately 26 to 31 AD. We're now moving into the latter part of his ministry, so later on in that time frame. In this chapter, as far as characters, we kind of have the usual suspects. We have Jesus, who is the main character throughout all of the Gospels. He's God's son, his disciples and apostles who are his students. Then the Herodians, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. We haven't talked about the Herodians as much, but these were all kind of enemies of Jesus. They were attempting to trick him, to find a way to get rid of him. And then finally we have David. David was the second king of Israel way back like 1,000 years before Jesus was on the earth. He was a really highly respected figure in Jewish history, and we're going to read about him towards the end of the chapter. Where do the events of chapter 22 take place? Well, this all happens in the city of Jerusalem in the last week of Jesus' life leading up to his crucifixion. Now, in the outline of the chapter, our first section is verses 1 through 14, the parable of the wedding feast. Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven could be compared to a king who hosted a wedding feast. When everything was ready for the feast, he sent some servants out to gather all of those who had been previously invited. But the people who were invited refused to come, and they even abused the servants who the king sent to bring them. The king who was hosting, he was really mad at all of these people, and he told his servants to go out into the streets and just gather whoever wanted to come to his wedding feast. There's one man who came, and he came without a wedding garment. And the king asked him for an explanation, but he didn't have an answer. The king commanded that the man should be cast out into outer darkness. And then Jesus concludes the parable by saying, "For many are called, but few are chosen." I've entitled section number 2, verses 15 through 22, Should We Pay Taxes? The Pharisees sent some of their followers, some of their students to Jesus to ask him a question to try to trip him up. They asked him whether or not they should pay taxes to Caesar, the Roman emperor. Jesus asked for a coin which had Caesar's face on it and proceeded to say, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's." And then a question came from a lawyer. He asked Jesus, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus responded to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind." And then he proceeded to name the second greatest command, and that is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they had all had their attempt to trick Jesus. Now Jesus asks them a question, and it's a question about why David called Christ Lord. This is verses 41 through 46. So in response to the Pharisees' questioning, Jesus asked them, why did King David, way back in the Old Testament, why did he refer prophetically to the Messiah as his Lord? If the Messiah wasn't going to come until much later, and he would actually be a son or an ancestor of David. Well, the Pharisees were stumped and they didn't know how to answer, and I think this really just served to prove to the people that the Pharisees didn't know as much as they wanted to pretend that they did. And that Jesus was really the person who they should have been listening to, not their corrupt Jewish teachers. So thinking about this chapter, and specifically the first part in kind of the big story of the Bible, you remember the parable that we talked about at the beginning, the parable of the wedding feast? Just like the invitees to the wedding who refused the invitation, the Jewish people were being invited by John, by Jesus, by the prophets into the kingdom of heaven, but they were rejecting it. And Jesus told them that like that king went out into the streets and called other people to his wedding feast, God was going to do that as well. And he would do that by calling the Gentiles later on into the kingdom. And then for our application, the Jewish religious leaders, Pharisees, Sadducees, they didn't ask questions to learn. They asked questions to accuse. And it takes a great deal of humility to ask questions correctly. Jesus always welcomed questions, honest questions, from those who wanted to know him better. And I think that's still true today. So evaluate your own heart. Do you have the humility to admit that you don't know everything, that there are things that you need to know, and then to go to God genuinely trying to find those answers?